walk around. There's more works in that space over there. And we also have a catalog, a monograph that's quite beautiful that we have one of the writers of here today at the front desk for you to thumb through if you get a chance. So please join me in welcoming Odili and Mitra.
Thank you.
Hi, Odili.
Hello.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here in conversation with you. I want to begin, because your work is so colorful and so full of patterns, I think that that becomes a dominant, that can claim a dominant space, but I actually want to begin by speaking about materiality. I'm really fascinated with the ways that your compositions shift and are transformed when they're on canvas, as we see in the works in this room, when they're on wood panel, as we see in the works in the back room, and then for those who are familiar with your practice, when they're painted into built architectural spaces. And that shift between canvas, between wood panel, and between built architectural space truly transforms, I think, the way that the color, the pattern, and the pictorial space invites and engages the viewer. So I wanted to talk to you first about how you think about the choices of materials, about the surfaces on which you're painting.
First, I want to thank everybody for coming out and taking the time to listen to us speak. I feel that the spaces demand their own interaction, and I've learned that over time, that clearly over time, that each space is clearly different and needs a different kind of working process. With the canvas paintings, the challenge really for me was almost a kind of historic one, dealing with painting as painting in a Western sense, okay? And what I mean by that is that you have four edges, and we have the reality of what sits inside those edges, and then the premonition or idea of something that exists outside of those edges. And I was thinking quite a lot about that in the early to mid-90s when I was starting this painting project. When I left graduate school in 1990. And cinema was the really big way of seeing painting or comparing painting or discussing painting, cinema. Mm-hmm. But I was in New York at the beginning of digital publishing and computer, computer work, mm-hmm. Working with a computer, like at the early stages of internet and, Photoshop and mm-hmm. Photoshop 1 and Adobe Illustrator 1.01, So we were like, in a way, masters of a universe at that time when it was coming to like working on the computer. Nobody knew what we were doing but hired us to do stuff, And I was fascinated with the space, that space, coming again from painting, comic books, cinema, mm-hmm. into the idea of this computer. The silver screen, the screen was large. And so you had this kind of landscape vista sort of thing with the movie screen, but the computer, it was small, mm-hmm. but still it had this space that was going like 1,000,000 miles times 10. And for me, I can say that was like the computer screensaver, seeing these things blip up on the computer and imagining this space that went endless, but knowing that it's only on this monitor, huge box. Today we have these laptops and stuff with this huge box on the table. And also understanding that I could project myself through chat rooms and project myself, if I wanted to, as a different identity mm-hmm. in chat rooms, where you're a different kind of being, a different gender if you want, a different name, however, or just as yourself, sending out texts in conversations about ideas of what this space was, because we were in this place where information was free, as they call that sort of space. And coming back to the paintings, I'm thinking about like how I'm engaging this space with this kind of allusion to or thinking through these other types of spaces, from the cinema to the computer screen, from the comic books to cinema to the computer screen. And then with my own cultural history and background, thinking about, as I went through the 90s, thinking about my place in the West, having come to the States because of the war, Biafran War that had just broke out, learning to assimilate myself in the States. And I've been thinking about this recently, just the fact is, there was a story of, we were flying over here and we saw the Grand Canyon from the airplane, and my wife was talking about the mountains there relative to her own experience in Switzerland. She's Swiss, and the trees, and how she might look at the mountains with a vantage point of the trees, and the way that she would look at them. And I was just fascinated with her interpretation, because I was like, I don't have any way of seeing maybe any distinct space of authenticity to speak about, say, a historical place that I might be at relative to these mountains that are similar to this. And I was fascinated with that space that she occupied. For me, as a refugee, let's say, from Nigeria coming into the States, seeing and living the American experience in that way, I realized that I really didn't have any grounding here in America at all, other than knowing that it is just an awesome space. And I mean by awesome space is that it's a space of power and power relations, and I have to navigate, I have to decode, I have to decipher and navigate it to survive. And so I'm thinking about that, like, wow, that's kind of a daunting situation for a young kid to realize right away, that they live here, but they're not a part of here. And they're reminded every single day that they're not a part of this place, yet they're living here and have to do things here and survive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a lot. We covered a lot of content in that answer. Gonna zoom out and zoom back in and say, so in terms of space, these paintings occupy, so in the ways that you are painting compositions that follow languages of formal abstraction, and yet they are always for you about all of these things, about your origins, your own personal origin story, the way that you have come to understand yourself as a person within America, the way that they call on lineages of history and the history of painting as a practice and an expression of power, and all of and coming of age at the moment. Indeed, if you graduated in 1990, the Photoshop 1, it was released in 1991, so coming of age at this moment where we're transforming graphic communication. I want to come back then to these paintings and say, these paintings are operating for us, thinking about all of that content. These paintings exist both at a scale that is much grander than a computer screen, that within that language we might consider cinematic. There's certainly a cinematic quality to these horizontal canvases. They also call on, and you've spoken about this, languages of commercial or graphic or graphic art and commercial, a color palette that is used for marketing, for graphic communication, that comes very much out of that moment of Photoshop and digital communication that made it possible to print everything in whatever, transformed our sense of scale and communication. How do you think about, and yet, there's also a quality to these paintings that always, and this is, I think, part of, and I want to take this to a different place also, but there's a part of these paintings that also operates, and it's part of why I think there's so often an art historical reference of your work as being tied to the figures of color field painting, is that this is a scale that in the late 1940s and the early 1950s and through the 50s into the 60s, when painting suddenly became this scale, this was referred to as mural scale. This was a grand new scale for painting itself. Mm-hmm. And that is a moment when the avant-garde is shifting from, a kind of dominant avant-garde is shifting from Europe to America and to the United States specifically. And you get this is a language that then is also, in terms of the history of painting, rooted in that moment of the art of post-war, of the post-war United States. And so I guess I want to take the scale conversation one direction. I want to come back to canvas versus wood. But let's, given all of those rich references, how do you think of your paintings are all, even everyone has a different scale, but they're all of this scale that is larger than the human figure?
Well, it's like, first of all, when I spoke with David Kordansky,
yeah,
it's like, we got to go all out for this show. And we gotta go big. And I was like, right on. I like this scale. The thing about these paintings.
Do you ever not go all out?
Right.
Odili?
Another thing to think about, to talk about here. These paintings are really something I learned about this scale is that when I was in the 90s working through this idea with what we see here now, working through this structure and the patterning, I made smaller paintings, of course, in my apartment that I had in Brooklyn. And I learned over time in the 90s that really I was making paintings that were headspace, or like headspace of a computer screen or of a TV set. And when I made my first large painting called Wall Painting, really the first large painting with this patterning inside of it, because I was not painting for a number of years. I was making photo-based work for a number of years, exploring identity politics in a figurative sense with mediated images for a number of years. And then at Art OMI, I got a residency there. Robert C. Morgan helped me to get in there. And I brought a bunch of paints and a bunch of canvas, and I made one big painting there called Wall Painting. I don't know why at the time I titled it that, but when I finished that painting, I understood the idea of scale relative to my head and my body. Then I started to understand something that I was wanting to investigate at the time more concretely, which I feel like I've investigated somewhat thoroughly for myself, is this idea of the body and space in the sense of the vista, in the sense of desire of vista, desire within a vista, within a view. That view was in a certain way at that time Africa, or my place with my relationship to it, my distance from it, my relation, my I can say my remoteness from that space as memory, as fantasy, and as a space of desire. And I was working through a color patterning, a color construct that was more muddy at the time because I was thinking about my initial travels to the continent, to Nigeria, and to see color and to see the way in which I was experiencing color was through this lens of dust and this patina of dust, maybe it's something distanced. So the color had a kind of conceptual aspect to it in that way, in which it was on one hand maybe observational and one hand maybe perceptual in the sense of how one sees memory through a haze, or one memorizes space or events through a haze of time. So that literal conceptual situation with color ended at a certain point when I realized, you know, all color is African color. I can't determine a space and say this space has this color or this space is of this color, because, you know, it's too quickly ending. It doesn't satisfy something bigger. So for myself, working at this scale is important because I recognize that over time with those paintings I started with, first I was staring at a space, and I had this idea of like going to the Grand Canyon, let's say, standing at the fence that they help you with so you don't fall into it, and just like looking at something. And when I went to school in Vermont, Bennington College, it was like that too, like seeing these mountains in Vermont, the green fields, and thinking, wow, this space, what I'm seeing from my eyes, it's so beautiful, but I am outside of it, or I am not in it, or I have to continue to walk into the space to feel a closeness to it, yet that space seems to keep going further away from me as I walk into it. Then over time, the pattern started to complicate a little bit more, and instead of being like a position of standing outside of a TV set or outside of a computer, I started to change the patterns where I felt like I'm placing myself or a surrogate of myself in the space. And I'm realizing all at the same time, I'm actually going through this kind of construct of figure ground and figure ground play where I'm going outside of pattern as decor or pattern as information, and placing myself almost subconsciously or subjectively into a field of play. So, you know, it's the way you can start to analyze and look at the way in which we can construct visual space historically in the West, and how that plays into the idea of a field versus a field with an individual in it, or the closeness or the likeness of an individual in it. But to make the longer story short is just to say that I understood a quite significant way how the body can respond to this space and this scale. And when I started to do installations, it became an expanded situation of understanding let's say, the energy of a space relative to the figure that is within this space. You know?
I'm really interested in this particular idea because when say, you know, Barnett Newman or Jackson Pollock started painting at this scale after, you know, in the 1950s.
And can I jump in and say,
Yeah.
that was really heroic of them, because, you know, these are painters working inside apartments and living spaces. So when they're actually deciding, you know, have School of Paris, they're painting paintings that they can carry around in a briefcase and whatnot under their arm. But these artists in the 50s decide to make scale like massive, where these are paintings that are larger than carrying, you know, you had to roll the painting. The painting was as big as the entire wall.
Right.
This is a living space. This is not today's 21st century, you know, airport carrier studios, right? These are like human scale apartments, walls
absolutely.
with massive paintings. So
That's
that's
the
like,
whole wall.
it's really,
right there.
it's really a huge accomplishment. It's a huge thing that they did.
What it did is it made the figure, the visitor, the viewer, the subject, the figure or the subject of the painting, and the painting became environmental. It became atmospheric. There's a quality I find in your work, which does exist in these, you know, grand, larger than life gallery spaces, museum spaces that have grown to shift the scale of painting in this way, the relative scale of painting. There's a quality of your work that is fascinating for the way that even whether on canvas or whether painted onto a wall and around a space or across floors of an architectural space, that exceeds the bounds, that exceeds the frames of the canvas. And it's part of how you're using angle. It's part of how you're using the intersection or the meeting up of color.
Yeah, and I wanted to just say 2 points to that. Like, when I initiated this project, it was just essentially horizontal bands relative to TV test band patterns. That's how I really thought of this. When I thought of how I learned things in America, it was through television. When I thought of how I looked at TV, and it always would turn on the TV, there was this explosion of color right before the first image, right? This explosion of color was the TV test band. This is in the old days, right? And I'm looking at that TV test band and thinking about it in the 1990s and thinking, wow, that's the space before language. In a way, like, that's the space I want to think about with these paintings, like the space before the word, the space before the exercise of power, before the exercise of language, when it's like, oh, the word that's used determines the reality you're in and the way in which you're going to see that reality. Just like the image from the TV tells you, this is what you have to eat, this is what you have to wear, this is how you have to think, and this is how you have to live. And as an African person watching this TV with these white people on there telling you all these different things, you start to understand right away power. So I wanted that space before all of that's selling and buying. And that was the TV test band space for me, the space of color. And then this other point that was really important was when I was in school, in graduate school, Rochelle Feinstein was one of my teachers, and she came to my studio, and I was, doing all sorts of things in my painting, mulch and detritus and trash and wires and more paint, and just piled, like I was a mini Anselm Kiefer, Julian Schnabel, just like all over the place. And she had a comment about the edge of the canvas. She said, why does that stuff go off beyond the edge? Why are you making all that stuff go outside of the edge? She said to me, the space of the rectangle, the edge defines the reality within. Everything that exists outside of that edge is meaningless or does not exist. And then in the 90s, when I was engaging identity politics, that notion stuck with me to a very clear way. I was working with I.K. Uday and a Rude magazine, and working with Okwe and Wazar at the Inka magazine, and we understood the politics of the magazine space and the cover especially, and what the power of the cover. I realized with that, with those ideas that Rochelle helped put into my mind, that in a way the space of painting is the same kind of power politic that I'm engaging in the world, where everything in the space is real and everything outside of it is not. And then I'm thinking, wow, it's just like the West and the other, the West and the third world, the West and everything else. The space within the canvas is the West and the power of the West, and everything outside of that doesn't matter, doesn't exist, is unimportant. And I realized that space that I'm trying to get to with these horizontal lines is that space of the other. And so for me, it became an idea of, what can I think about relative to this canvas? What can I think about when I think of the word possibility? How do I reach that point? What happens if I get to the edge of the canvas? Does anything exist after that place? And so with these horizontal bands I was dealing with, it's maybe more closer to that one, but these horizontal bands that reached to a point at the edge of the canvas, or the point that starts one direction and expands to the other direction, to the other edge. The question was, what happens to that color? Does it continue afterwards? Just like when I watched a movie, and at the very end of the movie you see the credits, what happens to the credits as they roll up the screen? Do they just continue, or do they disappear at the end and top of the screen? So that was my question about my own identity and this space of power called painting in the West.
This is going to bring me back to my first question. So when you're painting on canvas, the canvas is a tabula rasa, and it becomes about how to create, how to interrogate, how to engage that space within it such that it provokes or activates a space beyond it.
In what way? However, in what way? You're talking about any way, literal to the conceptual to the imaginary, everything. How, gender, everything. Yeah.
When you're painting on the wood panels, you're engaging an already fabricated pattern, because these wood panel paintings, the composition is laid down upon a wood laminate that has already a very graphic, in the case of these wood panels, a very graphic pattern, color pattern composition to it. How is that, what is the difference in that experience for you in terms of thinking both formally, process-wise, technique, and conceptually about the power within the frame and the power beyond the frame?
Well, it's a question of figure ground, definitely. I mean, it's the interplay of that. I think for myself, a couple of things happen. I know that when I'm working on the wood, it's a call and response situation, almost jazz-like, just like just total improv. I have to basically live with the wood panels for a while and just look at them for possibility. And possibility, what I mean by that is like, what could I do in here? And you have the same thing when you're looking at a blank canvas. You're like, what can I do in here? And those wood panels is like, what can I do in here, in here? When I'm working on an installation in a space, it's like, what can I do here? I have to take each space for what it provides. Like, again, with the architectural situations, I'm always looking at the energy of the room, or the situation of the building, or the situation of the building within the city, or within the context of the place I'm in. I've always wanted to have that level of engagement when I'm doing wall installation, because it was like going to biennales, as I was doing in the early 90s, or rather mid-90s to late 90s, for the first time, going around the world and seeing these exhibitions. I looked at them like, wow, these artists are like rock stars, going to places, going in, setting up, leaving. And I just didn't like that kind of experience. I wanted to have something richer, going to a place that I could have my time more invested in the space. History, let's say, learning a little bit about where I'm at versus just going in and leaving. So with the wood panels, it is an intense kind of call and response. And I think about my teachers I had as an undergrad primarily, and really at Bennington too. I worked with, Bennington, Philip Walford and Pat Adams and Sidney Tillum and Rochelle Feinstein, and very Abex kind of place. And I worked with expressionist teachers at Ohio State, Alan Crockett and Fioris West. He was a figurative artist, very expressionistic as well. But so I was kind of trained by these expressionistic type of painters or expressionistic artists. I had that sensibility really in my hand. And looking back, I realized I worked a lot with, these were the visiting artists at Ohio State. The TAs, visiting artists, were conceptual artists primarily. A lot of conceptual artists were coming in, and they actually were the ones to teach me about art in a way much better than the painters, because it was just such a big world, this painting world. All that stuff was so complex in a way, that with conceptual art, I felt like, oh, is that what you're doing? Like, it's just this step, and you're trying to do that? Wow, this is actually fun. Like, it's like thinking through stuff, and then making stuff to think through stuff, versus like the history of this picture is that landscape is that, and the person over there, and So I engage on these kind of meta levels of being expressionistic, improv-like, but thinking through the structure of what I'm looking at, and being embodied and empowered and motivated by seeing and planning and engaging the possibilities of what painting can become.
Given the improvisational, the intuitive, the you know, this kind of approach to your painting, taking each canvas, each patterned wood panel, laminate panel as its own opportunity for engagement, for call and response. I want to ask you about, I know you don't set out in that way. You really approach each space unto itself. You don't set out to paint a specific subject, and yet your paintings take on titles sometimes incredibly specific, Bombs Over Biafra, or the Justice League, Gustin's Worst Nightmare, versus the, in other cases, incredibly poetic or open and suggestive, such as Open or Exchange, or and so on. And so I want to ask you, because of the amount of concept that you're engaging, how you land at the specific versus the poetic.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, it's this painting, Open, I'm looking at it, and to me, it's like there's the cross forms, the double cross forms that happen kind of in the center of one half and the center of the other is like maybe a closed form, and then all of a sudden it opened, and it's the doubling. It's a painting. The painting is essentially this cross form doubled, and so it's almost like an origami. Like if you can imagine, like you're opening and then you're closing, and opening and closing, an origami fold or something like that. And I love the way that the greenish color creates an opposition to the blue color at the outer edges. Like there's a center green, and then the green goes across horizontally, and the blues, the outer blues go up and down vertically, and they create openings, but openings of a different register. Like the green is open at one level of physicality, let's say, or perceptuality, and the blue is open at another level of perception. And for me, it's sort of like the relationship between, you know, maybe the blue, maybe for me could be sky, or the idea of an implication of sky, because I'm not literally trying to have a color associate with something that we realize in the world, in as much as what we can imagine in the world. Like, why is it that we have blue, we think of blue and we think of sky? There was a time in our literature, if you look at the book Iliad by Homer, right? And it's like they talk about that the book has been researched, where they say the sky is not given the color blue. Blue, for the longest time, was never associated to the sky. They use all sorts of words to describe the sky, but never the word blue. So it's everything's a phenomena that we learn. I mean, Jackson Pollock, are we taught to like it, or do we naturally like it? I think we're taught to like it. I love it, but we're taught to really love it. You know, it's not that we innately like it. So if we look at things like this, like how our mind engineers a lot of the ways in which we engage things, it becomes very fascinating. But then we also realize that's power relations, and that's very, very serious stuff, extremely serious. So I'm looking at that, and I'm thinking about that gold green, and thinking about like my own ancestry, in the sense my own space, like my own past. And to me, that open is like, for me, the ultimate, that painting is like, it's open to the heavens. I'm open to my past. I'm open to my own history, and that's a way for me to jump. Like if you can imagine, like a movie Stargate, you know, jumping through something into another time. That's what that painting's for me. It's just like, wait for it to open, then jump in, you know.
And yet, at other moments, we land with paintings such as Bombs Over Biafra, which is a very specific, it's both personal and individual and historical reference.
I mean, that painting for me, when I started to see the title when I was making it, I was like, okay, this is really, I feel like this is happening. Like, I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking like that purple color, that wedge, that was painted so many different times, and I was like, there's another color, a couple other colors under that. And I'm like, and there was a lot of different colors in my mind for that, but I said to myself, I want the closest thing to the smell of oil in a night sky, in a bomb-filled sky. I want the closest color to the smell of oil in a bomb-filled sky. that's difficult, right? Because I'm like, am I going to go literal? Oh, it's going to be red because of blood. And like, or am I going to go black because it's like black because it's dark and oil is dark? Or am I going to just let my mind work with what the painting is doing? Am I going to let the painting work with me because the colors are here, this place, and doing certain things? And so then I realized it's really an interesting exercise because all artists have to deal with this. Like, am I going to engage illusionism and literalism to get to my point? Am I going to engage poetry and the poetic to get to my point? Or am I going to acknowledge what I have in front of me as material and get to my point? Can I use all the above, including the material, including the desire and the phenomena of thinking to get to my point? And that's really interesting when I'm working. That's, for me, is very interesting because it's the challenge of making, like knowing that one of the other could really take me astray from my point. But being fascinated with the fact, ultimately, this is paint. And this is a substance, and I have to engage that substance with what I'm thinking through and how I'm thinking through it to get to a place that's intelligible to me. Not literally intelligible, but intelligible emotionally. And so for me, that color could be anything to anyone else, but that color couldn't be that color without all the other color that I had to keep changing. That red, that brilliant red, changed so many times in my mind. And, you know, I can tell you where I figured out the color, but it would be like really ridiculous, but at least like, for me, I was at some place and I found that color there, and I was like, wow, that's what I gotta put into that painting tomorrow. And that's how I'm thinking about all these all the time. There's different ways of finding my space in the paintings, but it's always interesting to realize that I'm always have to be active and always have to be looking at things and always thinking about them at the same time.
I'm interested in the way that you speak about language, that color as a language and as a way of communicating emotively and conceptually. And I'm interested in the fact that you wrote an artist statement to accompany the show, and your artist statement for this exhibition, or the passage that you wrote, is about blackness, and it's about black as a color and as an abstraction, as an idea. And in a literal sense, there is very little black in this exhibition. There is, in fact, less black than in many of your, the hue or the
in a literal
color
sense, yeah.
Black in the paintings. And yet that is the statement that accompanies this exhibition. And to me, that's really comes back to that core of how, for you, language is a form of, or color is a form of language and of communicating ideas about power. And so I wanted to ask you about that choice, that process, and that choice to write that piece for this work.
Right. I mean, I think for myself, it's like what David Hammond says. I wanted him quoted, or wanted those ideas brought into this statement, and about this idea of the aura of blackness, of understanding, let's say, blackness, or understanding culture, identity in a way that it becomes an energy. And I mean, color field is interesting when you think about it as a style. But if you think about color field in the way that I'm trying to think about, like a field of energy, light, let's say. I mean, I was thinking of these paintings about the idea of dark, black, and dark is very important to me right now, because I'm interested in the pejorative nature of it, how, like, when people use terminology that refers to the dark, or terms that refer to black and or the dark, that it's always negative. And it's interesting to me, that situation, because it becomes performative performatively a reflection on the state of whiteness and blackness within social culture of the West. It's just another layer of racist thinking perpetuated. And we see it that it's like, okay, you can isolate it, it's there or it's here, but when you realize that these are foundational and that it's not only in previous texts, you can read, like Chromophobia is a great text, I bring that for my students to read because we talk about the fear of color in the cultural sense and the social sense. But you talk about like artificial intelligence, we have artificial intelligence engaging everything today. And we see racism and sexism in the way that which these are mapped and designed and coded. It's a perpetuation of the same thing from the soil to the fruit of the tree, let's say, this racism, right? And we can think about the ways in which we think of the dark and black, and in that sense, and for myself, I'm thinking about it in the way that in which I'm trying to bring darker colors together. I'm still interested in opticality and the energy of color, but I'm interested in the way in which people think that dark colors don't have light in them. When it's just, of course they do. When you are in a room of absolute light, you will see nothing. And if you're in a room of absolute black, you will see nothing. But even the iota, like you're in a prison cell, and even if a crack of light comes in, it will take time, but you'll start to see the definition of objects within this space. That means you're going to see color. So darker colors have light, have opacity of a varying degree. And it's all about these degrees of separation, and that's where the title comes in. That's what I'm thinking about primarily, these degrees of separation. It's a term used to connect people, third degree of separation, sixth degree of separation, third degree of separation, and now they call our world the second degree of separation because of the ways in which people can connect. But if we're going to literally take the term degrees of separation, and I'm thinking about them chromatically, but then I'm also thinking about them culturally and socially in the ways in which the Supreme Court, in fact, is systematically creating steps of separation in our culture with voting, with Roe versus Wade, with LGBTQ rights. I feel it's interesting to be able to look at how the manifestation of connection and then separation occurs in different fields of consciousness, different fields of life, different fields of interaction in life. And so it's not about turning things negative, it's not about seeing only things as positive, but about understanding this kind of like, in a way, I want to not necessarily be moralistic about one or the other. I kind of want us to just see it.
Yeah.
And we make our own decisions about if we want to manifest and maintain ideas that are ultimately sexist and racist, or if we want to maybe do something different. That's what I mean by the idea of possibility. It's not about anything but possibility. When I'm dealing with installations, wall painting, it's about what can a painting do in space. But let's take that further in our world and understand that what can we do in a space?
Yeah.
What agency can we give ourselves as we manage and manipulate space? And that's primary and core to the painting, my painting practice as well. What kind of agency am I going to give myself as I play with all the dynamic potential of space?
So this idea of how you're playing with space, it comes back to my earlier, something I was trying to get at earlier when we were talking about scale. And one of the things that I find really interesting about your work is that rather than relate to it in the legacy of, say, color field painting, for me, there's truly a quality of your work that recalls lineages of mural painting. And mural painting, from its figurative, social realist history to a very contemporary history, is about creating social spaces as well as pictorial spaces. Mural painting as a practice, as a history, is about communicating to a broad public and about creating a communal space or space of coming together. And it's very interesting for me to see particularly this exhibition where we have such a variety of compositions in this room and even in the back room, and to think about the way that this installation becomes, the way that the paintings in this installation relate to one another and create a space within and amongst each other. And I wonder how, if you think about your painting in its social or communal capacity to communicate.
I mean, that's my hope, to be able to have viewers come to the painting and understand something in the painting and understand something of themselves at the same time, to be engaged with what they look at. It's also my hope to make a beautiful thing, to make something that has beauty not in the, let's say, Western sense of like I collect it or I hold it. I think for me, beauty is really, for me, African or Nigerian, in the sense of just the gesture. Its beauty becomes a space and a point of consciousness, of awareness. It's like being in the zone, let's say, or being here, understanding what being here right now, and being, let's say, happy when you're here right now, and happy in the sense of accepting, you know, without fear, you know. I think that that's important for me to achieve that state of being in the work.
I also want to pick up and really foreground, you've referred to, how can you think about, you've referred to your work as having an African or specifically Nigerian or Igbo sensibility, that it comes from that relationship, that it's not, that you want to communicate in that register.
Well,
I want to ask you, so some here will know, and of course not, but maybe not everyone, that your father is a noted and notable artist who was part of the Nigerian avant-garde, who, once he arrived here in the United States, having escaped the Biafran War and of independence and that conflict, became a noted Africanist and art historian, writing on African art and specifically languages of Nigerian modernism. And that is I know, a core foundation that has informed, that gives you a real sense of operating in this, with that sensibility in that register. So I want to ask you to speak to the ways in which you see yourself, that as a part of your foundation, and then...
Yeah, my father, he founded the History of African Art program at Ohio State University, and he retired maybe 15 years ago now, 10, 15 years ago. But the thing is that he's my dad. I never took his class. Didn't want to. I grew up around all that stuff. My brother took his class, but I never took it. The thing is that I love the fact that it was just around me, and I was never pressured to say oh, you got to know this stuff and recite it or anything like that. But for me, it's become more important over time. And I think a lot of it has to do with just the way of understanding that I can look at the world in a different way. And I can actually appreciate the ways in which there are parallels to, say, Western ideas of time or cyclical nature of time, and, say, African ways or Nigerian ways of looking at those same concepts, of ways in which society and the community stand very distinct and important in, say, West African ideas of life and living, and to see correlations in that in the West to those same kinds of ways of living. And so for me, it's like all these differences and all these similarities really help me to analyze one versus the other. Helps me to understand like what I'm engaging in the West, in as much as it helps me to understand where I'm coming from with these stories that were told to me that gave me my own sense of authenticity to a certain extent, because authenticity is still something I think a lot about. What if my parents all of a sudden said, you know what, we're actually Eskimo and all those stories we told you were just fables? I'm like, okay, wow. You know, like, so what is the importance of stories given to people over time that they are led to believe this is who they are and this is what they are? What does it mean to live in a place and then be reinforced by the stories as you live in a place to tell you this is who you are and this is how you need to continue to live? And so it's really interesting to think about, you know, origins in that way and stories in that way, and I guess language, you can talk about it like that, but really the power of love or passion for concepts, for the ways in which you live your life. And so for me, it's like with the African thing, if anything, it's, I mean, these patterns and these structures, there's a lot of kitsch here. I mean, I'm engaging these spaces, these patterns as a means of beginning to initiate a conversation specifically. It's like we talked about earlier about the ways in which one constructs words, sentences, paragraphs, ideas, to be able to bring somebody forward in a certain way. And this is what I'm engaging with, this visual language I'm playing with. And in the sense of the idea of play, it's really important to know that that is what we can call play here in this context, space. I'm giving myself space to reinterpret with all the different means and access to the different kinds of language, visual languages I'm playing with. Like I had to give myself that sense of space, slightly so, when I was growing up in the States, to be able to understand what the hell I'm living through.
Yeah.
As I watch it come into my eyes and go to my brain. This world that I'm in, understanding that this code exists this certain way. When I'm at home and my parents are speaking Igbo, and we're eating food that is as close to the original as possible with all the ingredients that they're getting from the Chinese stores in town, because these are the only places they can get some of these ingredients. And realizing that there's a world that exists here in this house that's really different from the world that's outside that door. And then seeing like it's all just information that I have to assimilate and make sense of to survive.
I want to pick up on that because we're talking about your family and your growing up and survival. I want to ask you about tradition and survival as ideas that motivate and fuel your practice. You had said to me when we were speaking earlier that you see tradition lives through adaptation. And I loved that concept. I used to always, a dear editor who has helped many of my writings, she and I had one of her, you know, all editors have their personal pet peeves. She wouldn't allow us to ever refer to anything as traditional because it's a word that she felt was too often deployed without, to say that something was static. And I loved this concept you suggested that, in fact, tradition, like language itself, lives not through orthodoxy, but through adaptation. And I wanted to ask you in a kind of concluding question to speak to us about how you see yourself working with tradition as a means of motivation.
Yeah, I mean, it's something my dad would always say to me, like tradition can't live as it is. for it to live beyond today into tomorrow, it has to have, it has to adapt to its surrounding, to its time, to be able to become relevant again. And I understood that really easily. I mean, it became clear when I look at it, you know, when I go, you know, Nigerian friends coming over to the house and seeing one type of behavior versus another type of behavior. Like, you can't do that because of this, and, you know, or like, it's all good, you know. So for me, it was like, okay, I don't like, you know, that relative coming over and speaking like this and telling me this and that, it's really stifling. I understood it over time, thinking back, I understood it as the way in which it's to act literally in the way in which those systems were enacted back home. And then it's a lot about like, how do we preserve ourselves in the now, here and now? How do we want to preserve ourselves in the here and now in a way in which it's like meaningful and not laughable? And for myself, with, you know, I'm making these paintings, I'm making this, you know, this work. It's interesting to see, like, let me go back to when I first came, when I saw the install here. And the install was really well composed by, you know, Mike and Dave and a really great artist. And they composed a story here, and it's really interesting because to understand that you have any arrangement you can have, but then you make one that really works, is to understand the internal logic as well as the external logic of the paintings here in this space. I'm dealing with paintings that look like, oh, the school of Kenneth Nolan or the school of Frank Stella or the school of Colorfield and whatnot on one hand. And then when I walked past this room into the other room, I saw the distinction of those pieces that helped me to understand the distinction here. And then I realized really quite quickly, because I'm super critical of myself, I'm just looking, oh my God. And I'm thinking, oh wow, there's this patina of color here that's coming out of these paintings. Like, this room is got this purple, gray, brown space. There's something like low dim about these colors in this painting in a way that I just love this energy, this distinction. And when I go to the wood panel space, it's sort of like, that becomes like Andy Warhol, like all this kind of like, you know, like Duchamp and Andy Warhol together, like that kind of clarity, but graphic. And I'm then realizing that, you know what, I've always had to deal with people seeing this work and saying, oh, I've seen it before. I understand this. And it's to say, like, wow, how violent you are. You know, like, how violent. Coming to somebody and saying, I know what you are, I know who you are, and I'm using words to place you in this, put you in a space. When it's like, you know what, this work has associations with many different art histories. But it's like my experience in life, taking the information around me and making something new out of it, and being able to play with it. It doesn't have to be historically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Because then you're just playing the game again of power if you're going historically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Play is being able to take the dice or take the cards or take the numbers and seeing what you can make new out of it. And I'm using information, history, tradition, but it's in today's context. And I hope to always be engaged with the now and present. It's very important to be engaged with the now and present because this is where energy is. But we can't forget the past as we go into what tomorrow may be, what tomorrow can be. And that's a very African thing, what I just said there.
I really love the spirit of play as an engagement with possibility. And I think if we all think about how children play, there is inherent in that very spirit, in the very spirit of how we use the verb play, that it is always about discovering the kind of the extent of possibility.
But with the
for-
this and the that, children are super great, but when you're an adult and you play, you realize the danger. And that's really important not to disregard.
Yes.
It's super important to know that when you play a game, you can lose. And that's what makes the game actually more exciting.
We have time, I think. We have time for a few questions from the audience. Should we run microphones out, or should? Okay, sure. Please, in the pink jacket. You're up. Sure.
Or you can use,
Great.
You're featured in Penny Cornell's tome on abstract art. And he talks, his project is, making the resurgence of abstract painting at global, categorizes according to bodies, landscapes, different categories. And you are in the
landscapes, yeah, section.
and your painting is what the sawtooth goes down the center.
Yeah.
And he clarifies you as a wave. So I'm just wondering if you go along with that, have some thoughts about it.
Well, I mean, you have to ask,
In short, the question is to comment on Pepe Carmel's characterization of Odili's abstract painting as being a part of a larger engagement with landscape, and specifically a specific painting as related to waves.
right. I can say, well, I'm actually happy that that exists because it tells me that my paintings are changing and that there's growth here. Because the thing is that when he wrote that book, for example, or when he was looking at the work that he made to write that book, he was looking at the paintings that were more horizontally oriented in structure and format. He was going with that body of work, and at that time, that would be acceptable to say that that's a certain aspect of the work, and that was certainly something going on then. But the work, in my mind, is going beyond that. It would be hard for me to place his referent onto what I'm doing here. I could do it, but it would be a stretch to do that. So yeah, I mean, he was making something that was clear at that time, but that book was written a long time ago. Yeah.
My question, I was just listening to what you were saying about producing the work. It's almost like a jazz musician. And then with the painting over here, you were mentioning something about the bombs, about the smell. With your work being so colorful, while you're working, do you ever experience somewhat of synesthesia, where you're actually making a connection between not just the sense of color, but then maybe other senses of maybe even smell or hearing sounds or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I can say yeah, but I don't really want to stay in that place, and this is what I mean to say. Like, it's important to be able to allow myself to have the kind of experience that one would have when they see something for the first time. And that's really important to me, like, have that kind of sensorial experience of, like, I'm seeing this for the first time. It's scary when you're in that space because you don't know if it's right or if it works. But at the same time, there's a thrill in being able to get in that place. I love movies, for example. I love performances. I love art. But when I think about my relationship as a kid to comic books and then movies, it was sort of like the idea of constructing a story, the ability to construct a story. It's like the drama of it. And if you look at really good movies, you're going to look at how the colors and the light changes and the sound of the music changes and whatnot. The drama, the excitement of something, just the charge and energy. So for me, I do think about the color in a musical sense, in the sense of like sound. I do see it as light, and light to me becomes very piercing sometimes, like a physical kind of. I see light and think of it in a physical way. It becomes like light. The color is like a sound, and a feeling and a heat all at the same time. So if that's synesthesia, then yeah, I totally feel that, totally 100%. But it's like, I also want to think about it in a way that I'm thinking about composition and color relations and that kind of fixicity, because it's really important for me that that material works and that material registers in a way that's just beyond just idea. I don't want it to be an idea. I want to feel it. So yeah, and not yeah. But I definitely, like, I'm working on a painting right now in my studio, and I'm thinking about it, and I'm thinking, that color works. Ideally and sensibly, that color works. I could just leave that color as it is, but I'm like, I gotta change it, because I'm not feeling the color. And I'm like, why am I not, like, what does that mean I'm not feeling the color? The color works, it makes sense, but I'm not feeling the color. And I'm thinking, in time, what about 20 years from now? If I look at this painting 20 years from now, am I going to be like, that color works? Or am I going to be like, that color was, that painting wasn't finished? Or that painting looks bad, and it's like, and you performed badly. You made a bad painting. And it's like, I think about that, like, I don't want to have my paintings leave the studio and like 20 years from now, like, I wish I could take it back and fix it. You see those and you feel really bad. I feel really bad. It's another thing. It's like, people say you're only as good as the painting, the most recent work or whatever. Like, you're only as good as the thing you just made. And it's not true, really. You have the possibility of making other things, but there's a certain truth to it too. It's sort of like, what did you do today? Was it good enough? So there's these parallels that I have in life, that we all have in life, that you have in a specific thing. Could I have done better? So that kind of thinking is going into my decisions of what I got to do in the studio, but I also know that at a certain point I got to say, do it. Because I can sit there and think forever, and the beautiful thought is only in my mind. And I realized that that's what's beautiful in life. You just decide at a certain point, and you live with that. And that's kind of awesome too, if you did it the best you could. Yeah.
Beautiful work.
Thank you.
I have a question. I don't know if it's a good question, but what determines the size of the shapes that you have in your painting?
That's really important, actually, because that you're talking about scale relationships. It's totally important.
Related to the canvas size, or is it how loud or quiet you want the shape?
Well, I can say that, when I do these drawings, they're all done on like graph paper. I just do them on graph paper. There's a whole drawing process I have, which has really kind of become its own thing with just the graph paper. I don't do them on computers or anything. I just do them on the hand-drawn graph paper. And then the colors are kind of like in my mind. When I do wall installations, I do have to make a mock-up because people are paying hundreds of thousands of dollars for those things, and they want to like see it before they go into it. But for these canvas paintings, they're more personal in that sense, and I like to be surprised. So I'm not really like mapping them out on the computer or anything, but the drawing, I make the drawing. And I have in the past learned that, like the ratio of the drawing has to fit the ratio of the canvas to a certain extent. I can't make a square drawing for a rectangular canvas because it'll stretch the shapes and they won't maintain their organic nature, organic relationships I found in the original drawing. So a lot of that has to do with, like, when I'm putting them onto the canvas, I'm thinking a lot about what's the scale of that shape and how will my body respond to that as it sits there. And it's really important because I have art my students, they're like in school, like, make a drawing, just put on a canvas. I'm like, dude, you got to think about that canvas. You have to think about the space, the forms, and that you can't just put a drawing onto a canvas without thinking about, because that drawing is not the canvas. And that's the thing you got to know, like, this is not that. And that's really important to understand, that this is not that. That canvas is not the wood panel. The wood panel is not the wall installation. Those are three different things I'm talking about. And it's to understand what makes those three different things.
Are you working out the color relationships in drawing or in only?
I am, but not literally the blue with the blue and the da 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 da. I'm thinking about it on a different level, on a more formal level, on a more like intellectual level. Like, and I don't mean, when I say formal, and I'll just say it like this, the formal becomes conceptual, and that's what I find interesting with formalism. It can become very conceptual and help you to understand things in a faster way. Because the best way of doing it is what I'm doing, literally putting the colors down and so forth, but I have to conceptualize the space of color and the energy of color, and I go through certain formal steps to get to a understanding of what I'm going to be doing, at least that. And then when I start to deal with the color, then it becomes real.
I was curious about the role of repetition and pattern in your work from a conceptual standpoint as opposed to a formal standpoint. And also it seems like you really love cinema and you're really engaged with cinema. And I was wondering if there are any movies that you really enjoy.
Yeah, well, let's say my kid is studying film at NYU, so they're the ones that talk about the newest movies, because I used to be like, oh, I'm the expert, I don't know anything about anything. It's like, no way. That person's watched it 3 times already, and way earlier than I have. For me, it's like, to just get to your question, the repetition is super important to me. I love it. I think about it in the ways which, like, for me as a kid, it was like, Andy Warhol, or I think about serialization of comic book panels and so forth, and the narration that comes through that serialization of one after the other. Pattern is also part of the whole notion of repetition and what we can call like fields of energy or concentration. I look at pattern as energy. Pattern is power. The decorative is not negative in my mind. It's not, in the West, it's seen as, could be, there are many reasons, a few reasons why in the West decoration or the decorative is seen as negative, and good reasons, in fact, if it's utilized as filler, or if it's utilized in a way that it's just, filler. I think if you're understanding the notion of repetition within a space and how it builds things, if you look at your own skin and see the pattern that is in your own skin, if you look at closely at a wall and you see the ridgings of that, or a plant leaf of a plant, you'll see that the whole world is made up of patterns and repetitions of forms or shapes that lead to a construction of a field of this, that, and the other. So there's that. And then one of my favorite artists is Elaine Sturdivant, and I love that artist and the way in which conceptually they're engaging repetition as a means of power, engaging power, gender, the power of the phallocentric, and surmounting that on so many ways. I think I talk to my students about this artist, like the way in which they're engaging repetition is biblical, because if you look at in the Bible, the way they talk about, they say the woman was made from the rib of Adam, and then so the woman is in a way, in the biblical sense, a copy or from a formation of a man in that sense, but less than a man in that sense, in the way that it's written. It's to really, again, understand the profundity of language and ideas that come from that. So you have in the Bible, the woman is made from the rib of Adam. But then you look at this artist, Elaine Sturdivant, and that we're understood as just copies of male artists, but in fact what she's actually doing is making a new painting. They're not copies. And then it's to understand that, what is language? How do we understand the word copy? And the word copy means less than the original, or let's say, or the copy is a facsimile of something that is more powerful. If we look at Platonic ideal, Plato hated artists, painters rather, because they copied God. God was nature, the tree and the grass was the copy of God. In fact, the painter was copying a copy, third remove. So it's like, this idea of repetition goes to this extent for me philosophically, and I love it because it's endless. It's like, not endless in the sense of like nonsense endless in the sense of like, there's so many ways of which we can interpret the notion of what it means to have something outside of something else, or to understand representational art, representation. So like, I look at representational art as super conceptual because it's the thing that's painted is not the thing. It's like Magritte's, this is not a pipe. That's an illustration, in fact, but a great painting that puts you into some great considerations of thinking. So yeah, repetition is really important to me.
Final question, Odili. What surprises you? Oh, we have one question. I'm ceding my question to the gentleman in the back.
Okay.
Yeah, I was really intrigued by the response to the question about the landscape, because the women who think that this is question, I thought exactly that. I thought landscapes when I saw your work. I hadn't known about your work until last night. I started listening to the painting, and I said, wait a minute, let me listen to the stories. And I listened to your origin story, and I was totally intrigued. And I thought, these are definitely landscape paintings, because you're working from the periphery of society. And then you see a greater humanity that vantage point. This is my interpretation. And then you're able to come to a search for like landscape. It seems like
I mean, well, I think of like I think of like mindscape, you know, skyscape, seascape. Yeah.
would you say that it's more fair to say you're looking at these as interfaces?
As what?
Interfaces.
Interfaces like screens. Where maybe there's these other states in there.
Yeah, I mean, I would say yeah, to a certain extent. I mean, it's like, I mean, that's just, and it is one way of getting into the painting. Definitely, I would say yes, but there's other things as well. Like when you say landscape, when we're thinking of landscape, I love thinking about landscape. I love it. And I've thought about it a lot. And I'm thinking like, it's interesting, like for example, in painting terms, landscape painting is not the sexiest or the most important space to consider thinking when you're making a painting, right? But it's super interesting, you know, because it talks about these social things in as much as other things. You know, the concepts of how our bodies relate to that place in a sense of like home, and domicile, and nature and whatnot, right? But it's like, these are scapes. And I was at one point thinking not only exclusively landscape, but these are more than that. These spaces are not just landscapes of the body walking through a space, but they're landscapes in the mind. And they're scapes in the mind, they're mindscapes. And I like thinking about that better because in fact, they're employed in so many different ways. This painting in the back is super interesting to me when you think about the interface, because that is literally like, let's say, a photograph of a drawing on my table and I'm filling it with color. But when I put color in that space, I'm fascinated with the X-ray quality of that painting, as if I'm looking inside another space. And that to me is an engine for all this other possibilities. So yes, it's an interface between myself and the drawing and what drawing could do, and color becomes something that works with drawing to enhance the qualities of space. I think of Sun Ra's space as the place. And I love this on many different levels. I mean, it's really kind of a negative thing going into a positive thing. His space is a place. He's talking about a space where Black people can be flown free away from racism in America or racism on planet Earth. Space is a place where we can be free of that dogma. So that's really an energy that's the foundation and formation of that sort of thing. But then you got that beautiful music, and you got that beautiful poetic that happens. And this is what art does, and what art comes from. It comes from our pain. It comes from our experiences of thinking about things in the world. But then we have something that we call beautiful in the end of the day. And that's amazing, to take that pain or whatever and turn it into something more than that, you know.
2 final requests. Please do not miss the paintings in the back or in this second room. because they operate optically, haptically, synesthesically, that's a good word, in a totally different register, and it's very worth seeing both rooms. And secondly, please join me in thanking Odili for sharing so much of his mindscape
Thank you.
with us tonight.